to it. This is when I'm being subtle.
All right, gentlemen, we're now live, so just be careful what you say. Let's get going. It's been a little bit of a late start, but at least now hopefully the internet won't. Oh, no, my computer's moving. At least hopefully the all will stay good. My question to you is, the question that I have to start today is, if you ever were thinking, I'm assuming that in the last 30 or 20 years, you've never really done anything wrong. You've been a very holy person. So maybe there was a time in your life that you wanted to do something wrong, maybe when you were a teenager or something like that. What would have prevented you from doing that thing wrong? That's my question. Now, I don't want to get all the answers right up front, but I want you to think about what prevents us from doing things wrong. When there's something that we want to do, but we know that we probably shouldn't, there's something that's actually preventing us from doing that thing. And the question is, what is that? That's the question that we have today. So let's talk about this. In Judaism, this was actually a question that Joe asked a few weeks ago in a shiur, when we spoke about this concept of fear and about whether there's actually a space in Judaism for the concept of fear, whether we should be having fear in Judaism or doesn't exist. So fascinatingly enough, there actually is a commandment from the Torah. So remember, we're going in order of the mitzvot. Mitzvah number 3, almost as a general mitzvah, is the mitzvah of fearing God. Last week we spoke about the mitzvah of loving Hashem. This week we're going to speak about the mitzvah of fearing God. It's a mitzvah that some people think Chabad avoids, while other groups tend to accentuate. So I suppose it's not really what you would think of the first thing when you think of Chabad philosophy. But what you'd see is that the truth is it is quite a central theme to all of Judaism. You can never take any part of any element of any of the mitzvot out. Every commandment has to be there. So fear is definitely very central. But the question is, what does fear actually mean? What are we going to talk about? What is the meaning of fear? When is fear healthy and when is it not? When is it unhealthy to be fear? So I was hoping to have, I had before on the screen, I thought I did. Maybe I didn't. The pasuk from the Torah that tells us the commandment to be fearful. So the pasuk from the Torah to love God comes from where? From the Shema. Chassidish Kratz. The mitzvah to fear Hashem, the mitzvah of fearing God. So there is a talk about it. It's mentioned V'hayim Shemoah Tishmu El Mitzvotai. If you will listen to Magim, and it seems to be talking about fear.
ומה הוא עושה אם שומעים למצוות שלו? מה הוא עושה אם שומעים למצוות שלו?
אז זה אומר שיש שכר ועונש. Okay? So there's reward and punishment connected to it. That's a central belief in Judaism, that we believe essentially that there's but that's not really why we do things. We don't do things because of the reward and punishment essentially. That's just there as a bonus. It's like when you teach your kid and you want your kid to learn something and you offer them a reward, you don't want them to do it because the reward, you want them to learn how to do it so that they can do it by themselves. But because they're not at a stage where they're willing to incentivize and they're self-motivated, you have to talk about reward and punishment. And if you don't do this, you don't brush your teeth, you'll get this punishment, whatever it may be. There has to be consequences. If there's no consequences for our actions, we would never really be able to correct ourselves, correct our behaviors. So there has to be consequences and there has to be rewards for someone that does the right thing. But that's not essentially why we do them. We don't do them because there'll be a good outcome only. That's part of why we do them, but ultimately we do them because it's the right thing to do and it's a good thing to do. Something which is beyond the basic outcome. There's a deeper outcome. Outcome is a level of connection and meaning which is beyond anything that we could truly fathom in our understanding. So the mitzvah, the main mitzvah of fearing Hashem comes from a pasuk in Devarim. I think it's from Parshat V'eschanan. It says, Et Hashem Elokecha tiro v'oto tavot. God, you shall fear and you shall serve him. Okay, it's a direct quote from the Torah. Hello. Hi, Leon. Hi, Irene. Welcome. Good to see you guys.
You couldn't get in. Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's no problem. I've been having issues myself tonight, so we had a late start because.
Oh, good.
So I was struggling to get in myself.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. Well, good to see you. So we're talking tonight about the concept of what it means to fear God and what fear actually means. There's healthy fear and there's unhealthy fear. When is fear healthy? When is it not healthy? Right? When a lot of people live in fear. They live in fear. They're afraid of everything. It's almost like an anxiety. They're anxious about certain things, where they're anxious about animals, about the future, and they're just in a constant state of fear. Interestingly enough, one of the few constant mitzvot in the Torah is the mitzvah to fear Hashem. So we have a few constant mitzvot. One of them we spoke about last week is the mitzvah to love God. But one of the mitzvahs that you have as a constant mitzvah as well is the mitzvah to fear God. But fear is not healthy. It makes a person, what's the word that I'm thinking? Incapacitates you. It makes you unable to move, unable to do anything. That's the problem with fear. So when is fear good and when is it not good? That's the question. So if you're too scared to walk outside because you're worried that there might be a snake there, and there's no real reason to be worried about it, but that's obviously not healthy fear. But if you teach your kid that if you run in the street while there's cars driving, you could get knocked over, and therefore you give them a consequence when they do that, that's a healthy fear. That keeps them away from things which are dangerous, right? If the fear that you have is going to keep you away from things that you shouldn't be doing, that's good. But if it keeps you away, and unfortunately this is when it becomes unhealthy, when it prevents you from doing things that you should be doing, that's when it becomes unhealthy in a very generic sense. So if it's helping you stay safe in a normal manner, that's good. Here's an interesting story that I wanted to really start off with. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Chabad movement, of the Hasidic movement, he was prior to the days of Chabad. His parents had him at a very old age. We don't know exactly. Some people say that they were even as old as Abraham and Sarah, like 100 years old. So it was like a totally miraculous thing. Now, we don't have that clear, but that's what some people. We know that for certain that even before he was born, they were childless, and they were very old, and they literally had him at an old age. So whether it's literally the age of Abraham and Sarah, or they were like the age of Abraham and Sarah for the times, they were old. They had him, and the mother passed away a very short while later, and the father passed away when the Baal Shem Tov was still a little boy. Now, the story of the Baal Shem Tov is just really and truly fascinating. What an incredible human being. But one of the most important lessons that the Baal Shem Tov taught was that which his father had told him on his deathbed. He was a little boy. As far as we know, he was about 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old. His mother had already passed away. And think about this. If you were going to leave a message to an only child, what would you say? A child that's going to be brought up in a world with no family and no one. What is the message that you would leave him with? This was the message that his father Eliezer left him with. He said, fear no one except Hashem, not darkness, not light, not animals, nothing. Don't fear anything. Only fear Hashem. Now, what's interesting about this story is that the Baal Shem Tov, this 5-year-old kid, took it to the extreme. He ends up being literally unafraid of anything. He was not afraid to go anywhere. We're told that he used to roam around as a little child. His teachers and the people that had adopted him or tried to take care of him in the community, he was absolutely impoverished. His parents never had much money, and the community tried to take him in, but he did crazy things, like he would walk around in the forest and he wasn't afraid to be outside at night. Now, I'm obviously not saying that this is not the way we treat children, but what we do know is that same person is, if you look at today, he's one of the most influential Jews in all of history. But he had a tremendous fear of Hashem. He had a tremendous fear of God. He was one fear he didn't. The difference is, if by being afraid of God, that actually takes away all your other fears. So if you wanted to ask what's the truest and healthiest fear that a person can actually have, is the fear of God, because the fear of God means that when you're totally given over to that fear, nothing else is there to be afraid of. In other words, yes, he could be walking around in a forest where there could be dangerous animals and all types of things, but he doesn't look at them as, he says, I fear. What fear of God means, I recognize that God is with me every single moment. And therefore what I care about is how I behave, and I know that God is watching me. So when you have that godly presence, we know that God is watching over him, nothing can harm him. There's fascinating stories about, now this is not what I'm talking about here, this is not, don't try this at home type of thing. This is not what most of us are able to, a level that most of us are able to accomplish. But I want you to be aware of this idea. And it was definitely a Hasidic principle that they focused on not being afraid of anything in the world and recognizing that God is in control, and therefore the main and almost only fear that a person should really have is God. There's stories of, I don't even remember, but it wasn't even a Hasidic rabbi, I forget his name, I think it was Yitzchak, he was a Chacham, a Sephardic rabbi that went from Jerusalem to I think it was to Turkey at the time. He needed, basically the way it would work is these Jerusalem Israeli Jews at the time, it was in the 17 or 1600s, they had no money. They survived of the charity of people around Europe. That's how they survived. So they would send what they called mushulachim. And how did they send these people? They would make a lottery to decide who is going to go and collect money for the community in Jerusalem. And there was always a thing that whenever you gave money, you always gave money to Israel, and still exists till today, and of course has been always going. There were always Jews that lived in Israel, and they always struggled to survive, and they were always almost dependent on their brethren in the diaspora. So anyway, the one time they do this lottery, and it falls on the simple person, a simple Jew. I believe his name was Yitzchak, a Sephardic Jew, a very simple Jew. And people were disappointed, such a simple Jew is going to go and be our messenger. But you know what? It's God's will, whatever. That's why we do the lottery. And they sent him. When he comes and he arrives at the port of, I believe it was Turkey, they see that there's no one by the port, and they're not letting any boats dock. And they find out why. They get a message that there's the leader of Turkey, whatever he was called, has got lion pets in a little in-house zoo, and they've escaped, and they're roaming around town, and everyone's too afraid. And everyone's left afraid because they're roaming around the docks, and they're too afraid, so no one could go. Anyway, so the boat starts going a little bit away from the shore. This gentleman from Israel, he goes up to the captain and said, listen, I paid for my ticket. I want to get off now. And the guy says, what do you mean? You're crazy? He says, no, I'm not letting you off. He says, you have to find a way. I paid. It's my right. I want to get off the boat. Anyway, they lowered him into a lower boat one of these little boats, and he sailed himself to the side, to the dock, and he gets off. And the place is deserted, and literally he sees, as he's busy walking down the road, he sees lions. There's like a couple of lions that had escaped, and he walks up to them totally unafraid. And he calmly gets them, and he pats them on his side, and he walks them back to the king's quarters. And this is a famous story that had occurred. And as a result, he gets them safely back, and the whole city is able to start working again. And he gets known as this miracle worker. Why am I telling this story? Because he was totally unafraid. Why was he able to be unafraid? Because by him, he believed, had such strong faith in God that he was able to say, it won't affect me. And his belief and his trust in God was stronger, and his fear of God was more powerful. Now, that's a story that most of us can't live by, because if we were to be faced by lions, we would be afraid. And an animal, according to Kabbalah, only has power over an animal if we're afraid of them. If we're not afraid of them, they don't have power over us. So tzaddikim that have absolutely no fear, like the Baal Shem Tov, we're told that he was able to walk around and be unafraid of any of these animals or any thieves, nobody, simply because he was only afraid of Hashem. If your only fear is the fear of God. So that's the highest level of the mitzvah, but that's for the highest people. Let's try to bring it down a level that's something that at least we could relate to. What does it mean? How does it relate to us? So, we struggle to understand this concept of fear of God. What are we afraid of God? What does it mean? The most basic and simple meaning of the verse is God is watching every single moment what we're doing. And therefore, we're constantly in his presence. There's a fascinating little piece right at the beginning of the Code of Jewish Law of Shulchan Aruch, where it tells us how we're supposed to behave when we're getting dressed. Could you imagine? Just think to yourself. It tells you when you get dressed, you should ideally get dressed in a private room or covered under your blankets even. And you think, why? Why would I want to get dressed covered in my blankets? So it says, because by doing that, you're acknowledging that God is present even in your bedroom. And therefore, you don't wish to be disrespectful by walking around with your birthday suit. So therefore, even in your bedroom, of course, God's also under your covers, but that's not the thing. But you're still acting as though God is in your presence. It's the mere fact that you're saying, I will be respectful. So it's a strange idea. It's almost an undiscussed concept. We don't even talk about it. Something where God is literally living inside your life every single moment. There's a famous line from the Tanya that says like this: V'hinei Hashem nitzav alav u'maloch al uvochen klot v'lev. God is standing upon you, and he's watching everything, and he knows what you're thinking and what you're feeling. Now, does that sound like a good thing or a bad thing? What do you think?
If I not can talk with him, I can listen him.
You can talk to him. That's exactly the point.
But he's not answering me.
He is answering you.
When?
You have לא פתחת את האוזניים לשמוע לו. אם תקשיב לו, יהיה בסדר. Reuven is saying that I'm talking to God and he's not answering. And I say he is, but sometimes you have to be in tune to try to hear the answer. The answer is not always that easy to hear, but you have to find God always answers us. If you open yourself to the answer, it's there. He was saying, I'm talking to God, but God is there. Joe, what did you want to answer?
I'm just thinking Australia's privacy law is moot now.
Right. It's always been an issue, right? So we know that, in the old days, people used to say, God is too busy watching Yankel Shmirel. He can't be worried about me, right? Now we know we can have Zoom that is on one screen or you walk into like a security room where you see like 1,000 screens, and in one room you could see thousands of places, right? We know that there's pictures. You go into Google Earth, there's a picture of the entire Earth. So now we could fathom it, but we couldn't before. So we recognize now that for God to be able to see into every single detail in the world is really not a big deal. Not only is it not a big deal, it's not even not a big deal. In other words, it doesn't take up anything. When you've got infinite ability, it's meaningless. It means nothing. It doesn't take up anything. But God is there watching every single moment. He doesn't have to work. He doesn't have to exert himself, so to speak, to make it happen. He is present. His very essence is present. So what is the fear? The fear, so there's different types of fear. There's a great story that I used to watch as a kid. And when I was a kid, we watched they started, and now they have like thousands of them. But when I was a kid, there was like 5 Jewish videos, like kosher kid videos that my parents would let us watch. And one of them was called Someone's Watching. And the story is about a man that's walking down the road, and he sees an apple tree. And when he goes and he's busy walking down the road, he sees the apple tree. He is hungry, so he decides he's going to go and pick an apple, but he doesn't know if the owner of the tree is around. So he says to his cow, if you see somebody coming, please moo so that I shouldn't eat the cow. I think this is even brought down in the Gemara, in the Talmud, if I'm not mistaken. I think it could be in Maseches Brachos, the tractate Brachot and Blessings. But anyway, he goes and he starts about to take the apple, and as he starts taking the apple, the cow starts going moo, 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 like crazy. And he starts jumping, where's somebody? Runs back, and the cow nods and says, God's watching. God's watching. You think that no one's watching? Every single thing that you're doing, God is watching. You're never ever alone. So if the question is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? It's definitely a good thing. It could be a daunting thing. It could be a pressurizing thing, but ultimately it should be a helpful thing. I'll tell you why. There's 2 things. Number one, knowing that God is watching every single moment means that you're never alone. Never, ever could you be alone. And that's the way somebody like the Baal Shem Tov felt. He didn't just know it, he felt it. He was willing to go anywhere and everything. He didn't go in particularly dangerous situations. He just wasn't afraid if he had to do something because he knew God was with him. It's a big step. He just simply was not afraid. He was afraid of the way he behaved. He was not going to be willing. All he was afraid of was his own behavior. Am I going to be acting appropriately to the fact that the creator of heavens and earth is watching me? That's all that bothered him. That's all that he thought about. He wasn't afraid of the animals, of other people, because he recognized that's all that's happening. So it's a daunting thing because you know that God is also, but it's also a very comforting thing. To know that God is with you every single moment. It means that everything doesn't have some type of blog book that everything that you do he's taking down, he's looking for points and he's going to whip, and every time. That's not what the story is. Of course, there will be consequences when we do things wrong because that's healthy for us. The punishment, so to speak, is a healthy thing. If there's no consequences, we would never do the right thing, right? That helps us do the right thing, knowing that God is watching. There's a great story, a very, very strange story, I should say. There was the 2 great Rebbes known as Rebbe Elimelech and Reb Zusha. Rebbe Elimelech is one of the most influential Hasidic Rebbes because there's lots of dynasties that come up from him. They were brothers and they would travel around a lot. And at the beginning, when they traveled around, nobody knew that they were tremendous sages. Later on, people found out. Anyway, the one time while they were traveling, they came to a place to stop, and Rebbe Elimelech says he has to go for a rest. He said, "Wake me up when it's time to leave." Anyway, he had a short rest. He was resting for a thing, and it was time to leave. And there was other people around. They had some students, and she said to the student said to Reb Zusha, the brother, it's time to wake your brother up. We have to go. So what did Reb Zusha do? He went to the bedroom where they were resting. It was in a motel owned by a Jew. There was mezuzahs on the door. He took his hand and he placed his hand on top of the mezuzah and he covered the mezuzah. When he covered the mezuzah, his brother suddenly woke up. So they said, what happened? How did your brother, you didn't say, there wasn't a sound. You never made a sound. Just from covering the mezuzah, your brother woke up? He said, he's in such a state that he never stops thinking about Hashem. And when he goes to sleep, he relies on the fact that the name of Hashem is on the outside of the mezuzah. You know the name of Hashem on the outside of the mezuzah? Shin Dalad Yud. He relies on that to be, so to speak, the presence, being in the presence of God when he's sleeping. When I covered it, he no longer felt that presence of Hashem, so he had to wake up to start thinking about Hashem. That's what type of level he was on, which is something which is definitely unique and very special, but not for most of us. So here's the thing. According to this theory that I'm teaching you, this idea, there's only one proper fear that we can really have. As I say, this is a high level, but I'm just going to talk in truths, not in necessarily realistically what we are holding on, but at least we know the truth. Truthfully, should only be one thing that we're afraid of, and that's God, according to what we're saying. Like the Baal Shem Tov's father told him. Why? Because everything else has a limitation to it. We're afraid of not being able to pay our mortgage or our credit card or whatever it is, not be able to pay our bills. That's a very flimsy type of thing. It could change. Anything could happen. We're afraid of not being of something bad, of somebody getting sick, or we're afraid of something bad happening to somebody. All these things are not reasons to. Of course, we have to take caution. We have to make money to be able to pay our bills. We have to take care of our health or whatever it is. But fear is not a real thing. Fear, what are you being afraid of? That all those things have no real power over you. The only entity that has a true power to really harm you or to really do good is God. And of course, God does not want to harm you. So therefore, the question is, when I talk about fear of God, what are we being afraid of? What are you afraid of when you talk about God? Are we afraid of being punished? What are you really being afraid of? What's there to be afraid of? God doesn't want to punish us. He doesn't want to do anything wrong. Yes, Joe?
I want to ask about the English word fear, but the Hebrew word that it's derived from. I wonder now if fear is the wrong translation, and because it's hira, yeah. So is the root of the word that we call fear, is it actually awareness? Is it like seeing awareness?
Okay, so it is fear almost as we know it, but it's in a different type of fear. Yes, it is the concept of fear. When I was in school, we read a book called Shades of Fear, and one of the stories I remember was about a man that goes on a date, that the woman said, "Oh, don't worry, I don't eat it." The guy didn't have much money, but he took out on a date to a fancy restaurant. "Don't worry, I don't eat much." Anyway, she ordered this little thing and that little thing and this little thing, and he started to sweat, and he got really, before he knew it, she'd spent like a huge exorbitant amount of money on his date. That was a fear. We could just describe fear as all different types of things, but maybe my question will be answered now about what type of fear. It's more a sense of an awe, right, than fear. It's not just plain fear. But I can tell you that it is an idea of fear. So the most basic concept of fearing God is fear of the punishment, but that's not the real purpose of fear. That's not what we're really afraid of. We're not afraid of the punishment. That's not the real reason. That's a very simple idea. as a very low level. And that's the level that we should all start on. But we don't want to do the wrong thing simply because we're afraid of the wrong thing, of something happening to us. That's fine, because there are consequences. That does exist. But that shouldn't be the real fear. That's not why God truly wants us to fear.
It's a motivator, no? It's more of a motivator.
The motivator for what?
For how you conduct yourself in the presence of a king constantly.
Good. Yes, 100%. So there's a concept of fear. Sorry, I'm looking for this on my notes. Something went, I must. So there's 3 ideas of fear. The first idea of fear is that you're afraid that you're afraid of the punishment. The second idea of fear, we call it yira boshet. Yira boshet means an embarrassing. You're afraid of becoming embarrassed. What does that mean? It's like, could you imagine if you were in front of a really, really exemplary, prestigious, very incredibly powerful person, a president, or even an absolute genius? You know, you're standing either in front of real royalty, something it's hard to give a description today because we don't have this concept. The old concept of a king was a real concept of awe. Today's day and age, the closest you'd probably have is like a president of United States, but even that would be second to it, or the Queen of England, but you can't compare. Interestingly enough, when the Communist Party, when they had the revolution in Russia, and the Communist Party came in, and there was the end of the Tsars, there was one chassid that says it's a pity, because we've now lost the concept of what it means to fear God. We had an analogy, an example of it by the fear that people have of the Tsar, and now we've lost that idea. So what I'm saying is that it's an analogy. The analogy is like this: if you could think of like a king or a Tsar or a president, somebody that's really prestigious, and you could be afraid of them for different reasons. The one way you're afraid of them is because you're simply afraid to do something because you're worried you're going to get punished. That's a very basic level of fear. The next level of fear is that you go into the king's chamber, and you see the king in all his glory, with all these administrators and all these security personnel, all these security guards helping him and guiding him, and all these, the way he's dressed, the way the building looks, and you're just a simple person, and you're just in awe of the person. You're in awe of his personality, of his wisdom, of his power, and you just feel like you're totally, almost like insignificant in that person's presence. That's a much higher type of fear. So that's an awe where you're so awed by God, where you feel like, wow, like who am I in God's presence? That's a much higher level of fear, where you could feel God's awesomeness, how God is so awesome, so incredible, so infinite, so powerful. And you're not so just afraid of God, you're actually awed by God. That's called yira boshet, of shame, fear coming from shame. The next level is a level called yirat chet. Yirat chet means the fear of the sin. You're not afraid of God, you're afraid of doing something against what it causes. Not the punishment, but you know that every time you do something that the king wants, let's go back to our example, let's say you got a simple farmer, and he's awed by the king, and then the king says, I want you to takes him into his farm, into his garden, and he sees all these beautiful trees, you could eat whichever you want. That one don't touch. And he comes closer to that tree, and he's about to eat from the one tree, and he says, this is the tree that the king didn't want. And I know I won't get a punishment, I just won't be able to have that connection to God anymore, to the king. I will lose my connection with the king if I eat this fruit from this tree. So what is he afraid of? He's afraid of losing the connection to the king, not because of the benefits, but because he realizes that that's the greatest position to be in, to have a relationship with the king. So the same thing is over here. We're afraid, the higher level of fear is you're not afraid of the punishment. Even the fact that you're awed by the king is a great level. But even higher than that, you're afraid of what going against the king's will would cause, losing your connection to Hashem, losing your connection to God. And you recognize that your mitzvah connects you and you don't want to feel disconnected. That's the highest level of fear that we talk about in Torah. There's a higher level called Yirei Allah, which is a way higher idea. It has to be Kabbalistically explained, so we won't get into it today because it's a little bit beyond the time constraints that we have. Did you have a question, Joe, before I go on?
Several real life things go through my head as we went through those levels, not from my own experience, but I will share one that was taught to me, if that's all right. My late father, he told me life back in the shtetl in Poland. There's one story he told me I'll never forget about when, and it was a very, very Orthodox family. You know, they were sort of connected with the Belzer Hasidim and Sheboska and so on. So he told me something he remembered as a child, that they'd get a job to go down the street to buy something at the shop. The first time that the child was trusted with a few coins to go on an errand to do shopping. And my father told me the first time he was trusted with this job, his father gave him the coins and then immediately gave him a smack on the hand. And he said, you know, why am I being punished? And his father said, well, that's in case you lose the coins, because once you've lost them and you come home again, there's no point punishing you because it's already happened. This is beforehand. So
yeah, that's funny. I think it's a different age approach, to be honest.
Absolutely. So this is a very childish level of the fear, reward, punishment dynamic that you mentioned. And then there's a wonderful movie called Groundhog Day that some people may have seen, and there's an iconic scene in that. There's the adults now who have a little bit too much to drink. They're in a car, and they happen to get onto the railway tracks, and they're driving along the tracks. And because they're drunk, they don't care. They have no fear. And then a train is coming straight towards them. It's one set of tracks, and the train is coming head on. And the guy driving, he turns around to the passenger. He says, I'm betting he swerves first.
I like that. Very funny. Good. Okay, yeah, we used to play a game when I was a kid called Chicken. Do you remember Chicken? Did you play that when you were a kid?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. We used to do it on rollerblades. Hopefully nobody does it in cars or in airplanes or something like that. All right. I want to share my screen for a moment with you, and I want to show you something which is quite a powerful statement from the Tanya. Okay, could you see my screen? Okay, this is one of the most, Tanya, the book of, what we call a Hasidic book of teachings. One of the most famous chapters is chapter 41. Chapter 41 takes like a whole swerve on, like, we've been talking all the chapters previously about love and connection, and over here he goes on a whole different tangent. So I want to just read the first few lines so that you understand something interesting. It says, one must, however, constantly bear in mind what is the beginning of divine service, as well as its core and root. So, in other words, what's the core and root that you have when you're serving? What's divine service when you're serving God? What's the core that you should have? He says, there's 365 positive commandments, and there's, negative commandments, and 248 positive. Look over here. Ki afsha yira. So it says, what does the yira do? The yira, the fear, is the root of the sur merah. So let's look at it in the English to make it simpler. Fear is the root of turn away from evil. In other words, one of the commandments is that we have to avoid certain things. What helps us avoid them is fear. And ahava, love that you have for God, causes you to do good. He says, nevertheless, it's not sufficient to have love alone to do good. You have to at least have a certain yira tivit. You have to start off with having a natural fear. Now, you're going to ask me, where does this natural fear come from? He says it's musteret b'leiv kol Yisrael. It's hidden in the heart of every single Jew. Every single Jew has a hidden fear of God. What's that? Naturally, shelo limnod b'melech malchem lachem HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We naturally have a desire not to rebel against God. The only problem is that it's concealed. So you have to do something shutahei bit galut libo that will reveal it. Whoops, sorry, my computer's playing games. Oh, I'll try that again. This is the key words. We all have a fear. Well, fear is a healthy fear. That fear helps us be good and healthy Jews. The only thing is that it's concealed. We don't feel. When we say concealed, it means you don't feel. Do you feel a constant sense of fear of God? Probably not. And that's in a way healthy. But you want to have it. We're saying it's actually a healthy thing to have an element of fear. But you don't know about it. You haven't felt it. You want to bring that to the shore. You have to just reveal it. You have to reveal it in your heart, he says. But if you can't reveal it in your heart, at least start with your mind, your mocho. So what does it mean to start with your mind? Start to learn about it. Start to meditate. What does you do? What do you have to do? So here he says, and this is just there's a whole long, deep Kabbalistic explanation he's going to go into. But I wanted to touch the first idea that all of us could relate to, even in a short amount of time that we have left. Hainu litbonen. You have to contemplate b'machshavto in your mind. Al kol panim at least. What do you have to think about? Gadlut ein sof baruchu umalchuto. Think about the greatness of the infinite one, blessed be he and his kingdom. Now, we could all think about infinity. I'm just kidding, none of us can. But the very fact that we can't think about infinity, but we recognize that we can, how infinite when something is. When we think about the vastness of the universe, when you think about the detail, and the more you would spend time to contemplate, we know that historically, Hasidim would spend hours before they prayed on Shabbat morning, just thinking about the fact that Hashem is present in every single thing. And God rules over. So you'll say, I have no feeling of fear or love towards God. These are almost the same way. He says, Asher Malchut, Asher Hi Malchut Kol Olam. This is the rulership of all worlds, Elyonim v'Tachtonim, the higher worlds and the lower worlds. We live in the lowest of all worlds, the most coarse. What I mean is lowest as in the least comprehensible world. We don't see God. Higher worlds, revelation and knowledge of God is much greater. That's the higher worlds. Okay, now we're about to enter into a very Kabbalistic idea, so we're not going to have time to discuss it, but one day we will discuss it. This concept called Mamali Kol Almin, which is an idea which talks about how God fills all the worlds, and then is an even more sublime idea known as Sovev Kol Almin, which means that he's so beyond the world that the worlds exist, but without him having to even presently affect it. This is a lower level where God fills the world and, so to speak, interacts with the world. And then the truth is that God is so beyond that he doesn't even truly interact. And here is the pasuk, the verse from the Torah. Look at this verse, which I want to just show you. It says, Halo et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ani maleh. That's a pasuk directly written in the Torah, which says, I behold the heaven and earth I fill. God fills. When it says full, if God says full, it doesn't mean like we fill things up. It means absolutely every single iota. Okay. He goes on to add so much over here. So I'm almost having difficulty stopping to go back to what I wanted to discuss because it's such powerful ideas. He goes on to say, Umaniach elyonim v'tachtonim. He leaves the higher realms and the lower worlds, and he does this all for the sake of what? For us as human beings. Ki chayav adam lomar. A person has to say, Bishvili nivra olam. For me, the world was created. In other words, God creates. You see all this vastness, and you think, wow, God is so incredible. But think about this. God created all of that for you, for me. We're obligated to say, God created all of this to me. Not because I'm the greatest human being. No, because God cared about me and he's given me a special role just for me. If I don't do my mission, I will be missing. I will be lacking. Okay? So I want to pause there with regards to the screen share with the Tanya. It's one of the very powerful and almost like foundational little teachings from Tanya. It only comes back in chapter 41. For those that want to do more thorough Tanya teaching, I hope we're all learning. We'll hopefully get back into it on Shabbos mornings, hopefully soon, where we do a half an hour before davening. We haven't resumed that yet, but that's what we were going through. Anyway, what we're seeing over here is this concept of fear is powerful. It's so powerful because it changes our whole outlook in God, in the world. It causes us being afraid of God. It's not fear as in we're worried he's going to strike us down, but we recognize that all power is in God's hands, and therefore we want to have connection. You want to be connected to the most powerful, the one that has the real power, not some egotistic snake on the side of the road type of thing. You don't want to worry about that, even though, of course, you don't want to let them into your house. You don't want to be silly. You don't want to be stupid. But you just saw that shouldn't take up your headspace. Other fears shouldn't be taking up your headspace, because you are where you live where your head is. So your fear of God and the fact and the knowledge of God's presence is what should be taking up your headspace. You know, I could be talking nonsense, and what I'm saying may sound like it's not that interesting to you. That's fine. But I want to tell you one thing. There's one person that definitely agreed with me about what I'm saying. He's not a simple person. According to Torah, he was the wisest man to ever live. So what I'm telling you today is not my teachings. It's the teachings of, according to Judaism, the wisest man ever to live. Who was the wisest man ever to live?
Hanoch.
Hanoch. He was very smart. Who was traditionally the smartest man? Solomon, King Solomon.
Well,
Yeah.
good one, Joe.
What are the books that King Solomon wrote? Two of the most famous books that he wrote was, Shiur, which is one, it's a whole discussion, it's a love problem. But two of the other books that he wrote was Mishli and Kohelet. Proverbs and, I think it's called, no, not Chronicles. Proverbs is Kohelet.
Ecclesiastes is.
What?
Ecclesiastes, I think.
Ecclesiastes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, yes. Yes, that's correct. Now, at the end of both of them, he finishes with this. He talks about all pleasures from heaven. He had every single pleasure. He was the wealthiest Jewish king, the most powerful Jewish king in all of history. He wasn't just the wisest man, he was also the wealthiest Jewish man. He was the most powerful Jewish man in history, because we know that in his times he ruled more than any other Jewish man has ever ruled. He ruled a huge portion of the world. And he had anything and everything he wanted. And he said, I realize that everything is not. He says, Sof davar, I believe this is at the end of Mishli. He says, Sof davar hakol nishma. We say this at the end of the Shir HaMa'alot, according to Chabad custom. Sof davar hakol nishma. The final statement is everything is heard. Vet Elokim yira, and you should fear God. Vet mitzvotav shemor, and God his mitzvot. Because this is all man is. In other words, what he's saying is the most powerful thing that man could be is one that fears God. And then when it comes to, so that was, I think, Kohelet. And then when it comes to Mishli, I'm confused. Yeah, I think in Mishli where he writes the Eshet Chayil, I'm getting confused between the two, but I think it's Mishli. At the end of Eshet Chayil, the famous song that we sing, Eshet Chayil V'yimtza, right? About the woman of valor, written by King Solomon. The end, he says, Sheker achein vehevel hayofi. Graciousness and is lies, and beauty is empty, is nothing. Isha yirat Hashem hitisalo. Which woman do you choose? Who's a praiseworthy woman? A woman that fears God. So if you take the smartest man and you take his major works, what is his conclusion? And he writes about all these things. He says the greatest thing that you can find in a person is a person that has the fear of God inside of them. The person that has the fear of God is the person that is the most trustworthy, the most honest, the kindest, the best person to be around, the most thing. He also is the happiest because he's not afraid of anything else. He has the most strength. He has the confidence. He believes that God is with him and God is watching over him. He's not afraid because he's afraid of his own ego or his own shadow, or he's afraid of anything else. He's not afraid of God because he's worried that God is going to hurt him, but he's afraid simply because he recognizes that he's always in the presence of God. And that causes him to act, to do. He's a person of action. He's a person that gets much done. It's a powerful statement, powerful thing that we learn from this concept. There's so much more I wanted to discuss on this topic. It's obviously way bigger than what we set out for tonight, but if you want to end here, it's 9 o'clock, I believe. So you're welcome to end here. I'm going to just end off with a few more statements, but anybody that wants to go, please feel free. I wanted to just say a story, two stories that I would like to tell you. The one is by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is one of the great people that saved Jewry after the destruction of the Second Temple. And on his deathbed, an incredible story for another time, but on his deathbed, he turns to his students and the students say, give us another teaching, so give us a blessing. And he says, I bless you that you should have your fear should be like your fear of God should be equal to your fear of another man. And they said, that's it. That's the only type of fear. He said, trust me. When you're in the presence of another person and you know that somebody else is watching your behavior, you are much more careful about what you do. If you had that same knowledge, that same opinion about knowing that God was watching what you do, you would be more careful. So he says, of course, that's not the ideal, but if you can get that, you're on a good track. That's number one. Another story I want to tell you is the story of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. Now, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe fought against the communists. When the communists, everybody, Jewry was massive in Russia. There was literally millions upon this. People believe that before the days of communism, there was more Jews in Russia than possibly even Poland, which had, we know for sure, millions. But the communists were so successful that they managed to almost eradicate all of Jewry. And any prominent Jewish group got out of there. They didn't stay on, and most Jews that stayed just were forced to leave Jewry, to not practice anything. The only group that we know on that continued to teach Jewry undercover was Lubavitch, Chabad, under the auspices of the previous Rebbe. He risked his life and the life of everybody. Anyway, in 1920, around 1920, he was arrested. He was arrested by the Yevasexia. They were the Jewish secret service. They were the worst. They were the worst of any type, and they were very successful because they were Jewish and they were so anti-religion. He arrested them. Anyway, he was put into prison and he's brought for questioning. When he was brought for questioning, and he writes this in his own book, in his own memoirs, he walks into a room, and on the one side of the table, there's 15 people sitting, 15 higher ranking officers. On the other side is another 15. On the end, there's 3 like superior judges and interrogators, and then behind him there were another 3. He was surrounded by these people, and they start asking him questions. And in the middle of the questions, he says, listen, I'm not going to stop any of my underground work. I'm not going to tell you about where anything happens. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of anything you could do to me. And I'm not giving up anything. That's what he says to these people. These were people that killed millions of people. Some people believe that the communists under Stalin and other rulers killed even more people than Hitler. Anyway, one of those officers got extremely angry at him for having the audacity to say that he's not going to. He took a gun and he put it on his face. And he says, you see this little toy? This toy makes people like you speak. And he was totally unfazed. He said, that little toy will make somebody afraid that believes in one world and many gods. But somebody that believes in one God and two worlds is not afraid of that little toy. And we know that they were totally dumbfounded that somebody could say such a thing. What was he trying to say? He says, a gun, I'm here on a mission. If that mission means that it has to end with a gun, it doesn't bother me. My mission hasn't changed. I believe in God. I'm not afraid of death because death is just another stage in my life. At the end of one stage into another stage. My life mission, I know what it is. It's to continue Jewry. It's to teach Jewry, to teach Judaism. If you want to stop there, something wants to get in the way, nothing can get in their way. The only one that could stop it is God himself. And that's why I believe in God. I'm not afraid of that. And therefore, even if God wanted that to end my life, and of course, the end is history. He ends up eventually being freed after being put on death row. So let me just finish off with one last point, which is when we wear the yarmulke. Do you know what the yarmulke means? The word yarmulke comes from the word yarei malka, to fear the king. That's where the word yarmulke comes from. Kippah means a covering, but the original word was yarmulke, which means fear the king. It's fear of the king. And we know the story of it, behind it in the Talmud. It tells us a story of one of the rabbis that when he was a child, his mother was told by some type of dream watcher or philosopher or prophet or something that his child was going to grow up to be very bad or something like that, to do terrible things. So this woman, the mother, goes to one of the great rabbis at the time, and she says, I've been told that my son, I could see that he has bad tendencies as well. I've been told that he's going to be a bad person. So she says, the rabbi told him, you should put him on a kippah, covering over his head. And as long as he has a covering over his head, if he walks, he will never do something wrong. Why? It will make him remember God. Now, of course, we know it's not there. It's there to remind us. The reason for the yarmulke is to remind us, so much so that we even sleep with the yarmulke. We do everything with the yarmulke. Yarmulke doesn't have to be a yarmulke. It's any covering. It could be a cap. It could be a hat. Any covering over your head. And what's there to do? It's there to remind us of the presence of God. It has to be something that is obviously sticks out to remind us of the presence of God. So there's a statement in the Torah that says, Ma Hashem Elokecha shel mimach. Moses says, what has God asked from you? Ki im le'yira. All I ask from you is to fear me. Just fear God, nothing else. Now, the Talmud asks the question. It says, Atu yira milsa zutrasihi. Is fearing God such a simple thing? He's saying, all I ask for you is to fear God. How many people fear God already? It's not such a simple thing. So the Gemara answers an even stranger answer. He says, yes, it is easy. Who's it easy for? For Moshe, for Moses. So if you're Moses, it's easy to fear God. That's where the Talmud ends. So Chassidut asks the question, says, that's not an answer. What type of answer is it? Telling me that it's good. Moses says, all I ask for you is one simple request is to fear God. The Talmud said that's not easy. Who does it? The only one that does it is Moses. Oh, for Moses it's easy. So then why is he saying all I ask for you is Moses? So what is the Chassidus saying? The Chassidus answers is that every single person, is what I spoke about when I mentioned the Tanya, every person has an element of Moses inside of them. We all have a part that is one with God, that believes in God. All we have to do is reveal it. And then Atu Yira Milsizitusu, that will cause your fear to be. All you have to do is you have to reveal that part of you that is connected to God, and you automatically will have that fear. It's not as difficult as we spoke about certain things that we do, that we stop for a moment and we think about God's presence in every single moment. That helps us. Okay? So the fact that we're thinking about God constantly and just meditating on it actually helps us, and then fear doesn't become something daunting, it doesn't become something difficult, it actually becomes the greatest pleasure, privilege, and conduit to absolute greatness. Okay, I'm finished my spiel. Thank you, everybody. If anybody wants to ask anything, you're welcome, and thank you, everybody, for joining.
I just want to add to it.
Yeah, have a good night. Leon and Irene, good to see you. Did you guys get my Hanukkah message? I hope everyone got the message about Hanukkah on next Sunday in the golf course. We'd love you to come. Okay? It's just around the corner.
We got your Hanukkah message. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay, good. Beautiful.
Okay, thank you for tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good night.
איפה חנוכה? בקוסקו?
בקוסקו? גם נעשה בקוסקו, למה לא?
או בגולד קוסט?
Golf course. I was actually thinking I was going to ask Costco if they could put up a menorah. It's not a bad idea. I don't know if they're willing to do that.
Don't think so.
But yeah, it's a good idea, Ruben.
Oh, Gold Coast.
Shana Shavra Asinu Bewilbirds. Last year we did it at Bewilbirds. I just don't know this year about doing public. It might be a little bit more complicated.
תעשה בגולד קוסט.
אנחנו עושים בגולד קוסט, הם עושים, אני לא צריך לעשות שם. אתה רוצה לנסוע לגולד קוסט?
כן, בטח.
הרב ניר גורביץ', אני אשלח לך את הפרטים של...
כן, למה לא?
אז תגיד לי, בסדר. אנחנו צריכים שתעשה את על האש בשבילנו, קודם.
בסדר, לא בעיה, זה דבר, זה לא בעיה.
אוקיי, נוח, you wanted to add something, please.
אבל תקנה נקניקיות טובות, לא כמו לפני שנה.
Yeah.
לפני שנה, הביאו לך
צודק.
תקנה כבר נקניקיות.
אני מקווה שאליהם, אני שלחתי היום הזמנה בשביל הנקניקיות, ואמרו שהמכונה שעושה את הנקניקיות הטובות נשבר, אז אני מקווה שלא יהיה לנו בעיות, אז אבל בעזרת השם.
אתה יכול להזמין מישראל, יש לך זמן.
אוקיי, נוח, כן, please. No,
I think the fear. Yes. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think to an extent or to a large extent, that fear is inbuilt into the mitzvot, both sets of taseh velo taseh. Because every time you do a mitzvah or you refrain from doing something you're not supposed to, every single time you're not thinking in the back of your mind, I'm doing it out of fear, but you always make sure that you do it properly or that you don't do it. So I think that fear is inbuilt into every mitzvah. And so even without contemplating it, that's inbuilt into all of it. Because if you don't do it right, or if you do it right, and it happens all the time when I don't know, from your place and moving flowers around, and Chamushka says, no, you're not allowed to move it. Fair enough, but why? Because we're not scared. But it's that inbuilt fear that you got to do it right. And so, every time you go and you do it wrong, you learn to do it right. Or if you do it right, you do it right because of that fear. Not because you're such a tzaddik that you're doing it right and you're thinking, oh yeah, another kick to myself. I'm so good, I did it right. It's because you're going to do it right because of that fear.
100%. Yeah, you're doing it right because you recognize that, when you care about who you're doing it for, you want to do it right. You understand? Yeah. And you recognize this is the way it works. There's a certain channel, if you want to get the website to the right website, you got to put in the right name. If you type it in wrong, it's going to come out wrong. If you miss out the dot in chabaddingly.com au instead of the .au, you just ain't going to get there. So you need to have the details right if you want to get to the right place. And God's trying to teach us that just like in our world, if we want certain things to work, if you have one wire that's not in the right place, in most mechanisms, it just won't work. If you have anything that is missing the wire or the screw or the something is misplaced, things don't work. So if we could be so detailed in our lives and recognize that everything has to be working, including our health, has to be working all in line in order for things to work. So then how much more so in our connection to Hashem? So God doesn't really care whether we do this or that. Yeah, but if we don't do it with the details, then he recognizes that we don't really care. And then it doesn't really have any meaning. Yeah. Good point.
It's an interesting discussion, especially like the word respect sometimes appears when we talk about fear. And I was thinking that in Hebrew, respect, is there a Hebrew word for respect, or is that part of the fear concept?
Kavod. Kavod is
not respect.
Kavod. So yeah, well, I suppose I hear what you're saying. Generally, we say kavod is kaved esamicha ve'esimecha, which means to respect your father and mother.
Is translated as respect, but I don't think that's what it is.
בטח, כבוד ורספקט, מה קרה?
No, you're thinking more of honor. You're saying that it's more honor than respect. You know, we used to sing, honor your father and mother, honor your father. So if they learned, if that's the way they translated in kindergarten, it must be correct. You know, so it's, yeah, I think there's a truth to what you're saying. And I think you brought this up last time as well when we discussed this point, that there's an idea where there's a connection between kabed is more honor. Yira is kind of a mixture between respect and honor. So it is an element of respect. I think you are correct.
Yeah.
Respect means where you, because we don't have this real concept of awe, it's difficult to explain that real concept of awe and that fear in the same way. But it's almost more than respect. It's not just that you respect God.
It is more.
It's much, much more than respecting God. It's that you literally have an awe. You're in awe of the great. It's the most. It shouldn't even be a question. Of course, if I could be awed by any human being, and we all are, if we would be in the presence, you know, just click on YouTube and go and ask. I met my, you know, or my crush celebrity or whatever it's called, and then you see that they're all in awe of this person. I'm just in awe. You know, everybody in every field has their awe. You know, there's the greatest mathematician and the greatest doctor and the greatest scientist. If you appreciate who that person is, then you're in awe of them, right? And that's a much deeper thing. But if you would be in awe of a human being that has one particular talent that is quite incredible, how much more so would you be in awe of the creator and the source of everything?
Absolutely.
So I don't think that I think fear is an element of it. You're afraid of, fear means that you're afraid of something, you're afraid of it. What are you afraid of? You're not afraid of God as in the sense that you're afraid that is dangerous. You're afraid of upsetting, or so to speak, of ruining your relationship. Not upsetting God, because you can't really upset God, but afraid of the relationship. You're afraid because you care about your relationship. You're afraid of your connection, and you're afraid to do things which are just, you know, if that person that was your celebrity crush, whatever they call it, and you did something really stupid, you would be kicking yourself for a long time. You know, that's the way we should really be feeling, ideally, when we think of Hashem.
Yeah, that's a dynamic I can totally relate to. It's like there's an element of trust, and the word trust appears as well, isn't it? That in our relationships at home, all of us with families, you know, the reason we don't like to have a confrontation with our wife or children is because it can distance the person, and people are worried about losing that connection unless they feel so strongly underneath the confrontation that the bond is very, very strong and can survive the occasional argument.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Yeah, and with the fear, that's what I was going to mention earlier, is that there's a concept of pathological fear, is where fear is, as mentioned, is crippling, where the fear is a disease in its own state. So people who are afraid to go outside or have phobias, which is
Yeah,
really the medical name for the fears.
yeah.
So yeah, that's where fear is a mental illness, basically, but that's not the sort of fear that we're talking about.
Well, that's definitely unhealthy.
Mm.
I think everyone agrees that that type of fear is unhealthy, phobias. But unfortunately, that needs real medical. Um, it needs to be medically treated. Phobias in general. There's
Yep.
different levels, and I'm very well of family members and people that have phobias. Sometimes it comes down through the DNA. It's not a healthy thing. But what's important is to recognize that if a person has a phobia, that it's not healthy, and that they shouldn't be living that way. A phobia of anything is unhealthy.
Mm. For example, people say some people with OCD, they need to compulsively multiple times, so that would be a problem in Yom Kippur.
That's right. All those type of extremities, and Rambam writes about them. But that's an extreme level where it's definitely unhealthy. I don't think anybody would do. But there's even more subtle fears which are that are unhealthy. That's taken to extreme. I think everybody, even the most secular person, can recognize that those fears are generally unhealthy. Unfortunately, I believe that this pandemic, the media has really made certain people live in fear, and there's healthy fear, which means taking the right precautions, and then there's fear where people are literally afraid to leave their houses, and I think that's very sad. I'm saying, at least definitely in Victoria and Australia right now, where the cases are low, and I don't blame people 100%. I just think that's come to a point where it's unhealthy for many people, and at a time when there was when there's real fear, and when it becomes just, and unfortunately, and I don't blame anybody, I just say it's a recognition that these are not asking people to just go out and do everything crazy and not follow any of the guidelines. Not 100%. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that we should recognize when it's coming from a healthy place and when it isn't. That's what I'm saying.
Yes, a few people have commented that fear, mass fear like that, can be used as a manipulative tool, a tool of control of people.
We've seen that in a very extent way in the last few months. If there was ever, they're going to be looking back in history at this period in time, and to show all different types of tests in every country in the world, how they ordered, think about how in Melbourne, where, how they treated it over here, and compared to, the USA is a whole nother game, how it was treated over there, and the lack of fear in certain places, the lack of proper restrictions or guidelines or whatever it is. And then on the other hand, you have the overburdens of guidelines, all these little things. It'll just be a fascinating look back in history one day when you look at it. But I do think that that it's sad when people I've become crippled because of anything. If it's crippling your life, it's not healthy.
So to distinguish between like Yirat Shamayim and that man-made fear, which is a tool of